What would you do if, in a single moment, everything you believed about your perfect marriage turned out to be a lie? I never thought I'd find myself questioning whether my own son was really mine, until that day. Up until that day, I had always believed my life was predictable, well-ordered, and, to be honest, comfortable. Everything seemed to fall neatly into place: my routine, my job, my marriage. My wife, Janice, and I had found a rhythm in our daily lives with our 2 young sons. Sure, we had the usual challenges that come with parenting and balancing work, but I genuinely thought our marriage was solid, something others might even envy. It felt like we had built a relationship grounded in trust, love, and mutual respect. There were no obvious cracks in the foundation of our lives, or so I thought. But, as they say, life has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. That cool autumn afternoon turned out to be the moment when my carefully constructed world began to crumble. I had come home early from work, feeling under the weather. Little did I know that a simple act of lying down on the couch would lead me to overhear something that would change my life forever. It started innocently enough. After pulling into the garage and parking my car, I closed the door to keep out the chill. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the couch, hoping to shake off the nausea that was creeping up on me. Moments later, I heard the sound of Janice and her sister, Carla, coming through the front door. Since the couch faced away from the entrance, they hadn't noticed me there. I almost got up to announce that I was home, but another wave of nausea pinned me down, so I stayed put. Without intending to, I found myself listening in on their conversation. At first, it sounded routine enough. Janice was excitedly showing Carla a new dress she had bought for their annual trip to Chicago. This trip had become a tradition over the past few years. Every fall, Janice and Carla would take a weekend getaway from our home in Indianapolis to the Windy City, indulging in shows, art exhibits, and a bit of relaxation. Meanwhile, Bob, Carla's husband, and I would stay back to watch the kids. It was something we did willingly, figuring they deserved a break from their everyday responsibilities. I should probably introduce myself properly. I'm Jim, and my wife is Janice. We've been married for 7 years, and we have 2 boys, Ryan, who's 5, and Sean, who's 2. Life had been good. I worked as a middle manager for a large logistics company, earning enough to provide a comfortable life for my family. Janice had always taken pride in keeping herself in shape, even after having 2 kids. We had a healthy relationship, both emotionally and physically, and, at least in my eyes, things were going well. But what I overheard that day shattered the illusion I had clung to for years. It wasn't just about a dress or a trip. It was something far deeper, something that no amount of love or effort on my part could have prevented or repaired. It's strange how these things often come out by chance, completely unplanned, but once the truth starts unraveling, there's no going back. I had always thought we were the perfect couple with the perfect marriage. Carla and her husband, Bob, lived just a few blocks away, and over the years, we had become more than just family. We were close friends. We spent holidays together, had weekend barbecues, and did countless things as a group. Carla was like a younger version of my wife, Janice, and the 2 of them were practically inseparable. They even shared similar tastes, from clothes to weekend getaways. Carla and Bob had a little girl, Melissa, who was 3, and our families blended effortlessly. Everything felt right. As I lay there on the couch, waiting for the nausea to subside, I overheard Carla admiring the dress Janice was showing her. "Wow, that's a gorgeous dress. Has Jim seen it? Does he know you're taking it on the trip?" Carla asked. "No, if he saw it, he'd get suspicious. So don't say anything, okay? Ree's going to love it," Janice replied. I froze. Randy? Who the hell is Randy? My nausea vanished instantly, replaced by a strange tension that tightened in my chest. I stayed still, holding my breath, wanting to hear more, even though a part of me dreaded what might come next. Then Janice's voice broke through my spiraling thoughts. "Are you bringing something for Mark?" Mark? I thought, growing increasingly confused. Who were Randy and Mark? I've got some special lingerie hidden from Bob, Carla responded, her tone almost playful. It'll really turn him on. I have some special lingerie too, Janice added, her voice low and conspiratorial. Jim hasn't seen it either. It'll really drive Randy wild. My heart started pounding in my chest as if I had just run a marathon. Affairs. They're both having affairs. And from the way they were talking, it sounded like this wasn't something new, it sounded planned, well practiced. These weren't casual encounters, they knew these men intimately. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. How long had this been going on? Who were these men? How could I have missed it? Then, like a hammer blow, I heard Janice say something that knocked the wind out of me completely. Are you going back on birth control this year? Yes, Carla replied. I only wanted one child with Randy. It's lucky he and Bob look so much alike. Janice laughed softly. It's the same with Sean. Lucky he and Jim look alike too. Even Jim's mother says Sean is the spitting image of him. I felt like the ground beneath me had given way. The room started to spin, and the nausea I thought had passed hit me with the force of a freight train. Sean. My son. My 2-year-old son. Isn't mine. The words echoed in my head, over and over again. My hands were shaking, and I fought to keep from being sick right then and there. The bile rose in my throat, and my stomach churned violently. I stayed frozen in place, terrified they might catch me listening, but mercifully, they chose that moment to leave. I heard Carla mention something about dropping Janice off at home, and a few seconds later, the front door closed behind them. The second I was sure they were gone, I bolted from the couch and barely made it to the downstairs bathroom before I vomited violently into the toilet. My whole body was trembling as I clung to the porcelain, heaving until there was nothing left. Even when my stomach was empty, I couldn't stop the dry heaves that racked my body. It felt like every part of me was rejecting the truth I had just heard. Eventually, I pulled myself together enough to spray some air freshener around the bathroom. I rinsed my mouth, grabbed my jacket, and headed straight for the garage. My mind was reeling, unable to process the enormity of what I had just learned. I climbed into my car, opened the garage door, and without thinking, I sped down the street, closing the door behind me. I had no destination in mind, I just knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't sit in that house, in that life, with the weight of what I had overheard pressing down on me. My world had shattered in an instant, and I didn't know where to go or what to do. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. I drove aimlessly for a while before pulling into a nearby mall parking lot. I parked in an empty corner and sat there, trying to gather my thoughts and figure out what to do next. My mind was spinning with everything I had overheard. Part of me wanted to call my brother-in-law, Bob, and tell him what I had just learned about Carla and this guy, Mark. But another part of me couldn't even process my own situation, Janice's affair, Sean possibly not being my son, it all felt too unreal. I was still clinging to some sliver of denial, as if refusing to believe it might somehow make it less true. But as the shock faded, anger started to rise. Randy. The name echoed in my mind, fueling a growing fire in my chest. How long had this been going on? And who the hell was he? My nausea was back, but now it was mixed with fury. Then there was Carla's affair with Mark. What the hell was I going to tell Bob? I didn't know where to start, but one thing became clear, I needed legal advice. If this was heading toward divorce, I had to understand my options, especially if there was a chance Sean wasn't mine. And with Janice and Carla leaving for their trip in 4 days, I had limited time to figure things out. Without wasting another moment, I pulled out my phone and called my friend Jerry Matthews. Jerry and I went way back, we'd been friends since high school, and he was not only my golfing buddy but also a damn good lawyer. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. His secretary, Helen, picked up. Matthews and Associates, this is Helen. How can I help you? Helen, it's Jim. I really need to see Jerry as soon as possible. It's urgent. Helen knew me well enough to tell that something was off. She could hear it in my voice. Is everything okay, Jim? Not really, I admitted. Can Jerry squeeze me in soon? There was a pause, then Helen responded, can you be here in 15 minutes? I'll let him know you're coming. Yeah, I'll be there, I said before hanging up. I drove straight to Jerry's office, the knot in my stomach tightening with every passing minute. By the time I arrived, I felt like a complete wreck. Helen greeted me with a look of concern as I entered the building, and she didn't waste any time showing me to Jerry's office. Jim, come in, Jerry said, standing up and gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on? I sank into the chair and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Jerry, today's been a disaster. Honestly, I'm not even sure where to start. Well, take your time. Start from the beginning, he said calmly, sitting down and giving me his full attention. I told him everything, what I had overheard Janice and Carla talking about, the names Randy and Mark, and the devastating possibility that Sean might not be my biological son. I could see the disbelief on Jerry's face as I recounted the details. Jim, I've known you and Janice for years. This is hard to believe, he said after I finished. You've always seemed like the perfect couple. I thought so too, I replied, my voice hollow. But now, I don't even know what's real anymore. I need to know what my options are if this turns into a divorce. And if Sean, if he's not mine, I need to understand my rights. Jerry leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment before speaking. Okay, first things first, let's not jump to conclusions just yet. You don't have all the facts, and acting on assumptions could backfire. I'll help you, but we need to handle this carefully. There's a lot at stake here, especially with the kids involved. I nodded, knowing he was right, even though it didn't make the situation any easier. So, what do I do now? For starters, Jerry said, try to act normal. Don't let Janice suspect anything. You need time to gather more information before making any moves. If you confront her too soon, things could get messy fast. Yeah, I get it. But it's hard to even look at her right now, knowing what I know, or what I think I know, I admitted. I hear you, Jerry said sympathetically. But trust me on this. Stay calm, and don't tip your hand. We can meet again tomorrow morning at 9. I'll introduce you to Sam, a colleague of mine who specializes in family law. He's in the same building, and between the two of us, we'll figure out the best course of action. Thanks, Jerry, I said quietly, feeling slightly more grounded. I'll be here at 9. As I stood to leave, Jerry gave me one last piece of advice. Remember, Jim, this might not be what it seems. Until you have proof, don't do anything drastic. Go home, try to rest, and act like nothing's wrong. I forced a nod, though the idea of pretending everything was normal felt impossible. Still, I knew he was right. If I let my emotions take over, I could make things worse. By the time I got home, it was almost dinner. Janice greeted me warmly, but I could barely respond. I told her I wasn't feeling well and needed to lie down, using my earlier nausea as an excuse. Thankfully, she didn't press me. She just smiled and said, "Of course, honey. Go rest, I'll check on you in a bit." As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, all I could think about was what Jerry had said. Don't jump to conclusions. Gather more information. It sounded logical, but it didn't stop the ache in my chest. I didn't sleep much that night. All I could do was wait for morning to come, hoping that somehow, I'd find a way through this nightmare. Even though I told myself to focus on work, my mind kept drifting back to Janice. It wasn't the flu that weighed on me, it was everything I had learned and what still lay ahead. By 9 a.m., I was seated in Sam Ridley's office. Sam was a family lawyer Jerry had recommended, someone experienced in handling difficult cases like this. His office had a warm, inviting atmosphere, with a seating area of plush chairs arranged around a low wooden table. It looked more like a living room than a lawyer's office, but I wasn't there for comfort. After brief introductions, Sam got straight to the point. "Jim, based on what you've told Jerry, the first thing we should consider is hiring a private investigator to follow Janice during the Chicago trip. If she's meeting someone there, this could give us solid evidence." I nodded, processing his words. "Yeah, that makes sense. Keep in mind, though," Sam added, "this could get costly. Since Carla may also be involved, you might want to talk to your brother-in-law, Bob, and see if he's willing to split the expense. If both of them are cheating, we can deal with both situations together." I hadn't thought about involving Bob before, but now it seemed like the logical thing to do. "I'll talk to him," I agreed. Sam leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "The next step is to arrange for DNA tests to confirm the paternity of your kids. I'd recommend having your brother-in-law do the same. You can discuss that with him when you're ready, but it's something we should plan for." Hearing the words paternity tests made my stomach tighten. It was one thing to suspect, but taking a step like that made the situation feel painfully real. Still, I forced myself to stay focused. "All right," I said quietly. "We'll figure it out. We also need to protect your assets," Sam continued. "If a spouse senses that a breakup is imminent, they might drain the accounts. I suggest you move most of your funds into an account only you can access. Leave enough in the joint account for Janice to manage day-to-day expenses, but secure the bulk of your savings." I had heard stories about messy divorces, but hearing Sam spell it out made it clear how serious this was. I didn't want to think of Janice doing something like that, but given what I had overheard, I wasn't going to take chances. "I'll start working on that today," I said, feeling more determined. "I hope this turns out to be nothing, Jim," Sam said gently. "But if it's true, you should be in a good position to negotiate custody of your kids and a fair division of assets." I thanked him, though my mind was already racing ahead to everything I needed to do. After scheduling a follow-up meeting, I left his office feeling drained but resolute. I was preparing for something I had never imagined facing, but I had no other choice. When I got home that evening, I continued the act of being sick. I couldn't risk letting Janice know anything was wrong. She seemed genuinely concerned as she greeted me. "Why didn't you stay home today?" she asked, her brows furrowing in worry. "You shouldn't have gone to work. You look terrible." I gave her a tired smile, keeping my tone casual. "I didn't want to risk you or the kids getting sick. If you caught it, you might not be able to go on your trip with Carla this weekend." She seemed to relax at that. "You could be right. Maybe you should sleep in the spare room until you feel better." The suggestion caught me off guard, but I quickly agreed. "Yeah, that's probably a good idea." The thought of her trip, the one she was so eagerly anticipating, gnawed at me. I knew now that she wasn't just looking forward to spending time with Carla. She had been using these weekends to meet Randy, and they had been doing it for years. According to the information I had found, Randy and Mark were married men who lived in Milwaukee. Every year, they reserved adjoining rooms with Janice and Carla so they could spend the weekend together. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. For years. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment mistake, it was a carefully planned affair. They had built an elaborate lie around these annual trips, and I had fallen for it completely. I tried to keep my composure as we sat down for dinner. My stomach churned at the sight of Janice acting so carefree, chatting about her day like nothing was wrong. She mentioned how she and Carla had gone shopping earlier. "They had the cutest sandals," she said with a light-hearted laugh. "But they didn't have my size, so I didn't buy anything." I felt numb. The image of her laughing with Carla, knowing what they had planned for the weekend, made me feel sick all over again. Still, I forced a smile and pretended to listen. At one point, Janice gave me a strange look. "What's wrong, Jim? Are you mad at me for something?" I cleared my throat, trying to sound as normal as possible. "No, not at all. Just a scratchy throat," I said quickly. "Must be the flu." She studied me for a moment but didn't press the issue. Instead, she returned to her cheerful chatter, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. After breakfast the next morning, I headed to work early, determined to keep moving forward with the plan. Around 8:30, I asked my boss if I could take a couple of hours for personal matters. He gave me a concerned look. "How are you feeling? You didn't look great when you left early yesterday." "I'll be fine," I said, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's just going to take some time to recover." In truth, I wasn't sure how long it would take to recover, from the flu or from this mess, but I knew one thing: I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my suit jacket and briefcase, heading toward the garage, trying to keep my composure despite the storm of anger and frustration brewing inside me. Before I could leave, Janice called after me. "Aren't you going to wish us a good trip?" she asked with a playful tone. I forced a smile, though every word I spoke felt like it was scraping against raw nerves. "Well, I hope you girls are going to behave yourselves," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. She gave me a smirk. "We always do, honey. But there are always some cute guys to look at." My forced smile tightened, and I added more seriously, "as long as it's just looking. Because if you ever decided to play around, it would destroy me. I don't think I could handle it, and I know our marriage wouldn't survive." For a moment, she looked startled, almost like I had struck a nerve. But then, she quickly masked it with another smile. "You know I've always been faithful to you," she said softly. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but inside, I was seething. It took everything I had to turn around and walk out the door without showing how much her words twisted the knife already lodged in my back. Later that day, after I wrapped up work, I drove straight to Bob's house. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I thought about how to break the news to him. He had no idea his world was about to come crashing down, just like mine had. When I arrived, Bob greeted me at the door, looking puzzled by my unannounced visit. "What's going on, Jim?" he asked, noticing the packet I was holding. "What do you have there?" "Let's sit down," I said, guiding him toward the kitchen table. "I need to tell you something serious. Try to stay calm." He frowned, concern etched across his face. "You're scaring me. What's wrong? Are you sick or something?" "No, Bob," I said, my voice heavy with emotion. "I wish it were that simple. This could be the end of both our marriages." Bob went pale, sitting in stunned silence as I recounted everything I had overheard between Janice and Carla. I told him about their affair partners, Randy and Mark, and the damning evidence I had gathered. He listened quietly, his expression shifting from disbelief to shock as the weight of my words sank in. "You're sure about all this?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I wish I wasn't," I said grimly, handing him the packet. "This has been going on for years, Bob. I know it's hard to hear, but we need to face the truth." Bob stared at the documents, his hands trembling. "We have to do something," he said after a long pause. "I can't just sit here and pretend everything's fine." "I've already taken steps," I said. "We need to arrange DNA tests for the kids, and I've spoken to Sam Ridley, a lawyer Jerry recommended. We'll figure this out together." Bob nodded, though he looked completely drained. "All right. Let's do the DNA tests first." We drove to the clinic that afternoon and submitted our samples for the tests. They assured us we'd have the results by Wednesday. Afterward, we stopped by Bob's bank, where he made the necessary changes to his accounts, just as Sam had advised. On the way back, I suggested he stay at my place for the weekend. You shouldn't be alone right now, I said. Come stay with us. We'll get through this together. After some thought, Bob agreed, but he wanted to stop by his house to pick up a few things first. That evening, after we put the kids to bed, we sat in my kitchen, talking late into the night about what was coming next. The following afternoon, just after 4 p.m., I heard a car honk outside. Janice was back from her trip. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. When I walked out to help her with her luggage, she was all smiles, acting as though nothing had happened, as though our world hadn't just fallen apart. Hey, honey, she said cheerfully. I missed you. If she could act happy, so could I. I forced a warm smile, playing the part of the loving husband despite the anger boiling inside me. We missed you too, I said, taking her bags. The kids were thrilled to see their mom, and she spent the next hour playing with them, laughing like everything was perfectly normal. Watching her interact with them, knowing what I knew, made my stomach turn. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I received a call from Sam. He had reviewed the investigators' findings, and the confirmation hit me like a punch to the gut. Randy and Mark had been meeting Janice and Carla every year during these trips, sharing adjoining hotel rooms. The affair wasn't just real, it was meticulously planned. What's your plan going forward? Sam asked after giving me the details. I'll call Bob and set up a meeting, I said, my voice tight with emotion. After hanging up, I immediately called Bob, who was still at his office. As I told him about the investigators' findings, I heard him start to break down. His voice trembled as he quietly cried on the other end of the line. It took him a moment to collect himself, but we agreed to meet with Sam the next morning. The next morning, sitting in Sam's office, we watched the investigators' footage. The scene unfolded on the screen, Janice, dressed in a short black nightie, walking into a hotel room and straddling Randy on the bed. I couldn't watch any longer. I bolted from my chair, ran to the bathroom, and vomited violently. It felt like my insides were being ripped apart. When I returned, Sam had paused the footage, sparing me from seeing any more. I noticed the nightie Janice was wearing. It was the same one she had worn during our last intimate moment, just a few days before the trip. That detail hit me harder than anything else. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was woven into the fabric of our everyday lives, tainting even our most personal moments. As I sat back down, I knew there was no turning back. The life I had known was over, and all that remained was figuring out how to move forward. I nodded for Sam to continue, though my mind was already reeling. The video footage on the screen showed Janice on her back, with Randy on top of her in the missionary position. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay in the room and watch, though every second felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. Sam, noticing my tension, paused the footage. The investigator included their names and addresses in his report, he said. I'll make sure you both get copies of the report and the video before you leave today. Bob and I exchanged a somber glance before handing over the DNA results we had picked up earlier that morning. I took a deep breath and said quietly, Sean isn't my son, but I've raised him. I love him, and I can't imagine my life without him. I want to adopt him. Sam gave me a sympathetic look. You'll need the biological father's consent for that, he explained. But if you file a paternity suit and push for child support, he might agree just to avoid any legal trouble. Bob sighed heavily, clearly as worn down by all of this as I was. We spent the next hour discussing logistics, what steps we'd need to take legally and how to handle things with Janice and Carla. Before we left Sam's office, we agreed to leave handwritten notes at Randy's and Mark's homes later that day, explaining who we were and how they could contact us or Sam if needed. Back at work, I informed my boss that I'd be taking a few days off for personal reasons. He agreed without any pushback, sensing that something serious was going on. I made sure my staff knew how to reach me if necessary, then retreated to my office to deal with more pressing matters. First, I called the credit card companies and cancelled all joint accounts. I opened a new card in my name only. Then, I contacted our cell phone provider and cancelled Janice's line. I didn't want her running up any charges while I figured out my next move. Finally, I checked her email from my office computer. There, I found a message she had sent to Randy on Monday morning, saying she had made it home safely. My anger flared again, but I forced myself to stay calm. This isn't over yet. That evening, after dinner, I told Janice I had something family-related to show her. She gave me a wary look. "This isn't something dirty, is it?" she asked suspiciously. "You promised me you wouldn't bring any X-rated stuff into the house." "It's not what you think," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "It's educational, it shows how a family can be destroyed." Her eyes narrowed in suspicion, but she didn't press further. I brought out the video and played it. The screen showed a clear shot of the hotel bed. Moments later, Randy appeared, undressed, climbing onto the bed. At first, Janice didn't seem to realize what she was watching. But then, when she recognized Randy, she exploded. "You said this wasn't X-rated," she shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "I told you it was educational," I said coldly. "It shows exactly how a family falls apart." Her face drained of color as the reality of the situation set in. I paused the video and turned to her. "Here's the deal, Janice. The games are over. We'll divorce if it comes to that, and with these videos, we'll get custody of the kids. You won't get much from me financially. But if you think this marriage is worth saving, then tell me, how do you plan to earn back my trust?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked at me, utterly defeated. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know. You're my love. I thought it was just a harmless fling, once a year. I didn't think anyone would get hurt." I stared at her, my expression hard. "I'm your love. Would someone who loves her husband deliberately go out and get pregnant by another man? Explain that to me." She opened her mouth to speak but said nothing, sobbing instead. "The only reason I'm even considering letting you stay is because of the kids," I continued. "As of now, I haven't decided if I want a divorce. But if you argue with me or make things difficult, I'll make everything public, the video, the DNA results, and the investigator's report. Everyone will know, including your family, our friends, and the church. You won't have a life left here. Think about that." Janice didn't respond. She just kept sobbing quietly. I left her there, bundled up the kids in their pajamas, and took them to my parents' house for the night. I needed space to think, away from her and everything that reminded me of what she had done. The next morning, Janice called me, her voice breaking as she pleaded for another chance. "If we divorce, it'll destroy me. Thank you for even giving me a chance to redeem myself." "That's quite a speech, Jan," I replied coldly. "But listen carefully, you may not fully understand the conditions I'll require for you to stay. In fact, after hearing them, you might decide you'd rather leave." She remained silent, waiting for me to continue. "I want revenge so badly, I can taste it," I admitted, my voice low. "But unlike you, I'm thinking long-term. I've been in torment for 10 days, but your torment might last years. Have you considered that?" "I have, Jim," she whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes." "Good. I'll give you my conditions tomorrow," I said before hanging up. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I could hear her sobbing from the guest room. The sound should have evoked some sympathy in me, but all I felt was cold indifference. She had betrayed me, shattered our life, and now, she would have to live with the consequences. The next day, I outlined my conditions to her. "You will never be alone with another man again. Not even the pizza delivery guy or the meter reader. No more solo trips anywhere. If your mother is on her deathbed and I can't go with you, or someone I trust can't accompany you, then you don't go. You will notify me every time you leave the house. I want to know where you're going, how long you'll be gone, and why. You'll also notify me when you return. You will not have access to any credit cards or a cell phone. Those are the terms, I said firmly. Take them or leave them. I had already cancelled Janice's credit cards and her cell phone, so my final condition was simple but firm. 5. You will make yourself accountable at all times. That meant she had to live by the rules I had laid out, with no exceptions. I glanced up from the list, meeting her eyes. Do you have any comments or issues with these conditions? Keep in mind, any breach will be punished accordingly. Janice's expression remained calm, though I could see the tension in her posture. None. I accept them, she said quietly. Honestly, they're more lenient than what I would have given you if our roles were reversed. Thank you. Good, I replied, though her gratitude meant little to me at that moment. You know you'll need to get Sean's biological father to sign off on the adoption, right? I know, she answered, her voice steady. We're working on getting that signature. There was an awkward silence before she added, you should also know that Randy reached out to me. I cut her off immediately, my voice cold and sharp. I don't care what Randy has to say. Keep him out of our lives. Her shoulders sagged slightly. Yes, I understand. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to relax, but the weight of everything was still crushing. I couldn't stop thinking about the betrayal, about what this would mean for the kids. Just as I was about to drift off, Janice knocked on the door and peeked in. She looked hesitant, unsure if she should speak. Yes. What is it? I asked, annoyed by the interruption. I'm sorry, she whispered. I just wanted to say that. Without waiting for a response, she backed out of the room and closed the door quietly behind her. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Her apology didn't undo the damage, and I wasn't ready to hear it. The next morning, I woke early, showered, and dressed before knocking on Janice's door. We leave for church in an hour, I told her, keeping my tone neutral. She nodded silently, and I went to get the kids ready. We left on time and attended the service as usual, keeping up with our weekend routine. Afterward, we went to IHOP for breakfast, something we had done every Sunday for years. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing had changed, but inside, everything felt different. Back home, I spent the afternoon watching football while Janice worked on a crossword puzzle and the kids played nearby. For a fleeting moment, it felt normal, as if nothing had happened. But normal was an illusion, one that shattered later that evening. Around dinner time, I received a phone call. After a brief conversation, I hung up and walked into the family room, where Janice was with the kids. She looked at me curiously but didn't ask who had called. That was Randy's wife, I said, watching her closely. She's divorcing him. And Mark's wife is divorcing him too. Turns out your lovers were serial cheaters. The evidence I sent gave their wives all the proof they needed to leave them. Janice went pale, her expression crumbling. It's going to cost them dearly, I added, my tone cold. They'll be paying for their mistakes for the rest of their lives. She didn't say anything. Instead, she fled the room, sobbing uncontrollably. I let her go. I didn't follow, didn't offer comfort. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Over the following weeks, Janice adhered to every rule I had set. She called me every time she left the house, reported when she returned, and never spoke to another man alone. I even installed a home security system with cameras, and each evening, I reviewed the recordings. There was never any sign that she was breaking the rules. But the toll was evident. Janice was strained, walking on eggshells around me. Worse, it was affecting the kids. They had grown quiet and nervous, as if they were constantly bracing for something terrible to happen. It broke my heart to see them like that. My need for revenge, my strict rules, they were slowly destroying the very thing I was trying to save. Eventually, I had to ask myself, was this worth it? Was my revenge really helping anyone, or was it just causing more pain? After many difficult discussions, Bob and Carla decided to give their marriage another chance. They agreed to counseling, though their relationship remained tense. Whenever I visited, the atmosphere in their home was heavy, like a bomb waiting to go off. As for me, I chose a different path. I focused on raising my kids and decided against ever remarrying. The risk of another betrayal was too much, I couldn't go through that kind of pain again. Instead, I dedicated myself to being the best father I could be. Years passed, and though the pain dulled over time, it never truly disappeared. Occasionally, I thought about Janice, wondering how things might have been different if she had made other choices, or if I had been more forgiving. But those thoughts didn't linger for long. I had made peace with my decision. Life goes on. People heal, even if they never fully forget. In the end, I learned that you can't change the past, but you can choose how to move forward. For me, moving forward meant focusing on what mattered most, my kids. They became my purpose, my reason to keep going. Though I never remarried, I didn't feel like I needed to. My life was full, and I found happiness in watching my children grow. The real tragedy, I realized, wasn't the betrayal, it was the time we had lost, the love that had been wasted. But life goes on, and in that truth, I found my strength. Mistakes are made, and we all have to live with the consequences. I chose to live with mine by looking ahead and never looking back at the wreckage behind me.